So our first panel of the day is something that's very topical for LA, resilient rebuild, the state of our streets, cities, and logistics networks in 2025. We are going to be talking a little bit about how climate-sensitive cities are really at the forefront of change, as we have both a changing climate and changing technology for the curb. And moderating this panel is going to be LA Times reporter Colleen Shalby, and she is going to go ahead and tell us who the panelists are today. So let's welcome Colleen.
Hi everyone, thanks for being here. Our panelists today are Tiya Gordon, the co-founder of It's Electric, Jean O, the CEO of Tranzito, Justin Holmes, the VP of Public Policy and Marketing of Zipcar, Van Tucker, the VP of Tech Partnerships of Harbor Lockers by Luxer One, and Jarvis Murray, the Commercial Rideshare and Mobility Administrator for LADOT. Pulling up my notes. All right. So my name is Colleen Shalby. I'm a reporter for the LA Times. I am covering transportation, still a newer beat for me, and I've also been covering the rebuild post-fires in Altadena. So balancing transportation and our future in a lot of these communities. My first question, since it's Curbivore, I wanted to start with something related to curbs. And I dug into the archives and went back about 100 years and read some articles from the 20s about problems with curbs. Got real nerdy. It might be no surprise to you all that the problems relayed then was that there just wasn't enough curb space, primarily with parking. That was obviously the issue at that time as the automobile industry was coming up. And I wanted to ask, flash forward, that is still an issue, limited space. There are more mobility needs that have attention. There's more means of transit that are competing for that sort of curb space. So what do you think is the issue with curb usage, and what sort of problems what sort of solutions can be done or are being done to solve for those problems for the next 100 years or sooner?
I can get started. So, if one will think back, I'm not sure of the exact date, but, curbs probably came into play when fire hydrants first started to kind of be a part of reliable infrastructure. And we haven't really updated curb infrastructure since the fire hydrant in terms of something that's like a repeatable public use or private public use in every neighborhood. And what happens as a result is that things kind of get added on as ad hoc over the years, and there's not sort of larger approaches in planning. And I think that's what is unique about this environment, is that everyone here is doing extensive mapping and exercises to understand curb use and how it can be planned and thoughtful. And we really do need to think about what the next 100 years of a curb looks like. And I think that's the critical mission for everyone that's attending today.
We at Zipcar, we've been around now for 25 years, so a quarter of the history of the curb challenges, I suppose. And some of the things that we've observed about urban transportation in particular is curb use has typically been reserved for personal vehicle ownership primarily. And over the course of the last decades, Zipcar has been very fortunate to work with cities who have really understood that the curb is an incredibly valuable investment that they can use to accelerate some of their transportation and mobility related goals. So for example, in Zipcar's model, which if you don't know, we really pioneered or popularized car sharing here in North America, every one car that we put on the road takes away the need for 13 personally owned vehicles. And so it really can be an incredibly powerful strategy to reduce demand of curb space by dedicating just a small portion of that to models like Zipcar. And I think certainly that's been a historical challenge that hasn't really gone away, right? Curb space is still primarily used for personal vehicle storage. But I think increasingly events like this are a good signal that cities are really open to alternative uses for the curb that better align with their mobility goals. One of the things that we've really worked closely with cities on is pilot experimentation, right? The curb, I know we also know, is incredibly fraught, as you hinted towards, a really politically volatile space, right? God, how dare you take away my God-given right to free parking? And so by starting innovative pilot experiments, we've been able to prove the value of investing curb space in alternative uses that can effectively scale from there.
Yeah, I think to add on to that, the question of if there really is a problem with curb usage, I think it's a yes and no answer, right? Yes, there is. What we're seeing over the last 10 years, I'm sure all of us are aware of it, there is an undeniable demand for curb space that's growing, right? Package delivery, on-demand delivery, micromobility, ride hailing, all of these actions require curb space, right? So it's an infinitely growing demand for a finite supply. So yes, there's a problem. But to the point of the late, great Donald Shoup, no, it's not a problem. What it is a lack of prioritization and allocation, right? There is curb space. It's just that we have decided as a society and culture to prioritize on-street parking at the behest of all of these other demands, right? And what we're noticing now is that these other demands are actually clogging the right-hand lane. They're causing, illegal double parking. They're cruising for miles, and that right-hand lane is getting clogged at the expense of bus riders. And now all of a sudden the bus time is getting slower, and you're really having the situation where the environment is suffering because of greenhouse gas emissions, but also equity is suffering at the very same time. So this conflict that's going on, yes, there's a real demand supply issue, but no, there isn't. It's about us as a culture deciding what's really more important.
And if I can add to that, I think the challenge as someone representing a city is that we have to find a way to ensure that the curb is properly shared. I think I've heard Justin say this before, that kindergarten taught us all to share, but the work that we do has taught us that no one learned that lesson in kindergarten. And so a lot of what we have to do on our side is find a way to ensure that residents, business, commercial interests, mobility hubs, all are able to share that space. Because I do think Gene is correct when he says that the curb is there, but prioritization is what's missing. And even just an inventory of what we have as a curb. I mean, Los Angeles is such a large city. Part of the challenge that we're trying to do now is inventorying our curb and trying to inventory it in a way that 5 years from now is still relevant. Because I can tell you, as someone who even regulates taxi cabs, I have a bunch of taxi zones in the city that are no longer used, but at one time were very popular and heavily used. Again, the priority has changed, the neighborhoods have changed, a lot changes throughout time within our cities, and so it's up to us as a city to be dynamic and continue to be flexible, and I do think digitization of the curb is going to help that over the next 100 years.
My next question is about electric vehicles. According to a recent Gallup poll, interest in EVs has waned slightly since 2023. Different makers have obviously struggled over the past few years, and there's currently this pushback against Tesla and Elon Musk. So how do you draw people into this space outside of current owners, outside of people who are already committed and thinking about how to be more sustainable? How do you broaden accessibility in that area?
From the perspective of the EV person on the panel, accessibility is limited by the ability of being able to charge. So the limitations for people adopting who aren't already adopters is the price of electric vehicles and then the infrastructure. So if they don't have very easy at-home charging, it creates a barrier. They have to basically do destination charging. They have to go to a parking lot on the weekend. They have to go to a fast charging station. And we're in LA, so this is very different than if you're in New York or Boston or Chicago or DC. This is the Oz of EV charging, relatively speaking. You can find charging pretty easily, as opposed to a city like New York. So for us, it's about increasing infrastructure so that that conversion is it's a no-brainer for a lot of people that are looking to make that adoption. Something that I'm very interested in is in regards to the backlash with Tesla and the secondhand market being flooded with used Teslas. So people that were prior limited in terms of their accessibility based on finance to EVs are now looking at a market where they can get a secondhand Tesla for $15,000. And if that can help open up adoption for more drivers, I think it's a very interesting unintended consequence, but one that can be beneficial for wider adoption of electric vehicles.
I can add, at
For
Zipcar,
$5,000.
At Zipcar, we began a very serious effort to electrify our fleet just a few years ago or so, and among the things that we learned were 89% of our members, who typically live in cities or incredibly progressive urbanites, had never before driven an EV. And so our opportunity was not only to help give them exposure to these vehicles, but to really educate them on the value of electrification. So in a way, not only are we continuing to try to build and grow a business, but now we also have to educate a whole market on EV adoption, which is a challenge. And I agree with Tiya, the biggest opportunity I think that we have is to really significantly strengthen access to infrastructure. That is the number one barrier for us in terms of electrifying our shared fleet. And that's acutely true in big cities, as you mentioned, in a city like New York, where the vast majority of people live in dense housing and don't have access to a space to garage their vehicle. We're going to miss that entire market, right, by not providing access to infrastructure for people. And I would add that I think as many cities continue to step up, as other sectors of government might take a slight step back on infrastructure at the moment, I think what the opportunity we have is to really fully close the electric transportation access gap. From my perspective, it's not sufficient just to provide access to a charging unit in a city. What people really want is access to electric transportation. And rather than, particularly for communities that struggle with affordability and access to a car in particular, paying the premium to access an electric vehicle is further cost prohibitive, never mind the challenges of garaging that vehicle. So what we've worked with many cities on is spreading access to EV car sharing through nonprofit organizations, housing authorities, grant-funded expansions, to really solve what the customer, the user, the citizen really needs, which is access to clean, safe, reliable electric transportation, not just a charging unit, really completing that full picture.
And I think a big part is, EV, we're talking a lot about vehicles, but also other forms of vehicle, like bicycles, are a big thing that lots of people can get access to. That an EV bike, before you had to ride your bike, it'd be in shape. Now now more and more people are using batteries on their bikes and actually exchange the range, and that's much more accessible. Kind of still like a mini electrical vehicle when you have an electric bike. A lot of them you don't have to even pedal anymore to get around, and that's where you see a lot more cities adopting different policies around batteries in these bikes that do have a lot of issues. So that's where the curb is interesting. We're going back to the curb. A lot of these cities, like, how do we use the curb and the sidewalks for these EV bicycles as well? Also with the EV vehicles. So I think when we think of EV, we're talking a lot about vehicles. That's what the EV stands for, but also the rise of more bicycles and other transportations that you see around cities for even deliveries are being done on a more micro level. Vehicles that take a lot less space and lets us get a lot more volume through it.
There are so many challenges with all of those things, but he's correct in that we're looking to find ways to actually almost extend our power grid to ensure that this is viable. Because even as we think about the power infrastructure for EVs, we're also thinking about it for bikes or scooters or whatever other mode begins to enter our streets. And so the challenge for us is also, how do we make it public? Because even with the Tesla issue, the people that are turning them in are mostly people who own single-family homes and are able to buy them and charge them at home. On the ride-hail side, our drivers are mostly apartment livers. They can't afford a single-family home, so there's an affordability issue already with that, which is part of the car share experience or ensuring that there's some availability. But because of that cost, the ride-hail drivers that are buying them, it's, even if they want to go to that secondary market, their first question is, all right, now where am I going to charge it? I'm going to buy this, I'm going to bring this Tesla, and it's now $15,000, yay, but now I got to charge 3 blocks away, or I got to leave it somewhere. There's all these little things that they have to think about. But I think one of the major challenges, and I don't think it should be overlooked, and I'm not doing it to pour water on it, is just our power grid. Our infrastructure really needs an upgrade in order to sustain the EV future that I think we all want.
Okay, that brings me to the next question related to infrastructure. Because of so much of the projects that are happening right now do rely in part on federal funding, and there's a big question mark about whether federal funding will be pulled on some transit projects. Grants are being pulled here and there, and we know the high-speed rail is a target right now in California, but a lot of these agencies are wondering who's next. How do you move forward in building up infrastructure and moving along with these sort of projects if federal funding is in jeopardy? What sort of solutions are out there to move ahead if you can't rely on the federal government to help? I could take that.
We're trying to answer that question now. Some of you have decided to go to Coachella instead of coming here, so we have to think about this. But no, in reality, I really think the thing that we as a city are grappling with is how do we rely less on grants? Because, this administration's one thing, the administration's changed, it's up and down, the cycles are often sometimes hard to predict, or it's becoming harder to predict. And so now we're in a space of, well, it doesn't matter who's in charge. Can we rely on it at all? Especially even now, Los Angeles is in a budget crisis. Federal dollars for this, we need federal dollars to rebuild from the fires, So I think the thing that we're looking at is really almost looking to the private sector and trying to find out, are there incentives that we can work together to put together in order to produce this kind of infrastructure? We have the land perhaps, or we have the power, or we have the ability to assist with permitting. So maybe it becomes, hey, you're an expert in power draw or EV charging. Why don't you help us manage this? If we can give you the locations and give you access to the power grid, you tell us how this can work and be most functional across the board for our residents and the communities. I really think that's going to be the way, because for them, there's a large upfront cost. Hey, Jarvis, can you help us defray some of these costs? We can help defray some of those real estate costs. We can help defray some of those permitting costs. You can bring that, and then maybe as we allow the public to use it, we can start to offset. It's not something that over a year, but you almost like are amortizing your costs over time. But those are some of the things that we're thinking about. I don't have a full answer, but I really think the beginning answer is partnering with private industry to help us move this forward.
Yeah, I can. If you want like a Venn diagram of a chart that shows reliability on federal subsidies, just look at the stock market chart from the last 3 weeks, and that's where it's going right now. So I think that cities are realizing that they're on their own for the most part, and there's state funding, and there's obviously like ratepayer funding that can help bring things together. But trying to find silver linings, I think there's something that's emboldened in a city's first approach, where cities are finding solutions through public-private partnerships to, again, like decrease costs of permitting so private companies can come in and bring solutions that are going to be beneficial for everyone. So finding companies that offer, costs that are like no cost to city bids are very interesting and very appealing. So I think from the private side, my company's always been a free model for cities, but other cities have to kind of start reevaluating if they were built off of assumption of federal subsidies in order to survive. That model is out the door now. So there's a lot of clamoring that's happening on the private side to figure out how to now work in the new framework. And so I think, again, public-private partnerships where there's very clear trade-offs that are happening in terms of accessibility and access in trade-off for the operations, the maintenance, the hardware of whatever the infrastructure is a very, very exciting path forward to kind of be like, we can strap together arm to arm and do this without federal help.
Yeah, I really appreciate what Jarvis said and what Tiya said also. This is a new reality, right? We're not going back to where it was. So for us, for example, we're involved in the bus shelter program in Los Angeles. We're bringing in revenues, right? So that is a revenue generating asset that's also providing benefits for bus riders. But it was because the city took ownership of the program, right? Let's look at the extreme side. Chicago went ahead and privatized their meters, right? And as soon as a private company took ownership and got a 40-year concession or contract on that, they jacked up the prices, right? So who's actually benefiting and profiting from that contract? It's a private industry. With the bus shelter contract, the city's paying for the CapEx. They now get to determine what gets built where, and they're generating 60% of the revenues as opposed to 20%. So that's smart investment. That's where investment becomes smart and becomes revenue accretive. Now, another model is what Jarvis is talking about. If cities can provide the real estate, then private parties can build on top of that, right? The great example is, when we're talking about curb space, right? There's already revenues that are generating on-street parking, but let's imagine that all curbs are a singular entity. It's a living and breathing organism, right? And they are dynamically changing based upon the need. So an on-street parking space can now become a loading zone, can now become a pickup drop-off zone. This living and breathing, now all of a sudden you don't have a supply-demand issue, and now also you have the opportunity for dynamic pricing. And so this idea where the city takes ownership of their assets and then utilizes that with private industry to invite them in as a carrot approach, not a stick approach, I think can benefit everyone.
Great. My other question, semi-related, I feel like there's a lot of talk now about these public-private partnerships. It feels relatively newer. Do you think that this conversation should have started years ago? Is it something that's been in the mix but is now getting more attention because of this adverse effect of the federal government? I guess just what are your thoughts in terms of the timing of how public and private are working together?
I mean, I can speak from Zipcar's experience. I mentioned before, we're 25 years old now, and we were around 7 years before the iPhone was invented. So if you just reset your mind back to the year 2000, that was when Y2K was a thing, which feels like a generation ago. But I think as Zipcar really got started in Cambridge, Massachusetts, some of our very first catalysts to help our company grow were cities, right? City of Cambridge was really effective in helping dedicate curb space 25 years ago on this unproven, untested business model. Remember, there was no sharing economy then. People had a different name for it. They called it crazy, right? And the city stepped up and understood that, hey, this has a value to our residents. Let us make an investment in this public-private partnership that is rethinking the nature of infrastructure, as we were talking before, right? We at the time weren't asking for money, we weren't asking for capital infusion, we were just simply asking for space that cities had in an abundance of, right? So that early investment really was the seed that helped grow Zipcar across the country, and now we've proven that model and scaled those public partnerships that really help bring us closer to where our members live and accelerate the kind of impact that cities want to see with more sustainable transportation options. So I would say, from my perspective, these kinds of public-private partnerships have been around for a very long time, and we as a company have really benefited from the courage and the risk-taking of cities who understood that their ability to help grow a company and grow an impact like we have.
Yeah, I think that even with us with smart lockers, we put lockers around cities, and we've always dreamed of working with cities more. It's like, how do we work with cities to put lockers around cities? And one thing we always find is, how do we do that at scale? It's hard because every city has their own process. It's actually, how do they move the priorities around, and how we move faster with it. So often we initially started putting lockers, you see them like Amazon type lockers, they put them in private sector locations, just because to get the flywheel started, it's actually faster to go work with the private sector, where those locations are often not the best for the community. The dream of these lockers that we do, we now have about 500 of them around the United States, but you see like in Europe, there's this much more nimble approach to the curb and the sidewalk. We want to put them in cities and parks, near homes where people can drop things off, have their packages delivered there. Say if they don't live in a nice Class A apartment building that has a locker solution, they can use as an alternate delivery spot for their packages. So I think one of the big things for public and private partnership is, how do we make it easier for companies to kind of move faster through it to get access to a curb or putting up a stand. That's where the local community is really what powers commerce, and that's why you see a lot of these tech companies kind of get a little crazy. They like, hey, instead of working with the cities, they say, I was gonna go back Uber, got started. Instead of going through all of it, they say, I wasn't gonna take it over. We're gonna start driving around, or Airbnb. And I think that's a perception that's changed a lot in recent years. A lot more pilots are happening in the city, Santa Monica and LA, and even New York with like lockers. They're putting lockers around the city for packages, and also they're doing lockers for EV bikes to have them secured there so to prevent fires in buildings. I think it's already happening. The public and private partnerships are getting better, but now with the capital in budgets, the private sector is a way how we can kind of bring revenue to the city, and that's what like kind of Gene's working on. Is how do we make it a win-win for the community that live there, but also bring revenues into the city's key as well.
And Van, just for anyone who's not familiar with the delivery lockers, can you just share a little bit about how that feeds into this push for sustainability and reduces emissions?
Yeah, absolutely. So lockers in the United States are in this very early stage. We're part of a company called Luxer One, where we put lockers around multifamily apartment buildings. We have 12,000 of them around. And initially that's for how do tenants get their packages more secured. But the big problem is how do you actually get that outside and get in a more national scale to do it. So the way these lockers work, just like an Amazon lockers, but we open them up to other carriers that can deliver them as access delivery points. And that's like what the most common use case is for a locker. But one thing we get really excited on is how these lockers can be used for commerce. That's what we call marketplace lockers on Harbor, is how local entrepreneurs can use them to build businesses and solutions. So say if you're a small business, you may be selling some bread. We have a company we work with that sells bread around the country, and these local entrepreneurs, they can actually bake bread, they cook it in their micro kitchen they may have, and they can go deliver the bread in a nearby locker, and their customer can pick it up anytime. Before they were using the lockers, they were just driving around in their car, dropping the bread off, wasting a lot of time, but also from the carbon footprint of even that small use case of bread, it could be, instead of him driving, parking, he can just get it all done in one hub, and all of it goes into. So, the delivery companies are the biggest way to cut down costs is using lockers on the eco side of gas, but it's also those micro entrepreneurs that I get excited about.
I'll move on to public transit. How are you getting more people to use public transit? How does something like car sharing fit into this? How does something like some of these different services play into a balance of public transit and car ownership? What are your thoughts?
The fewer people that own cars, the more people that rely on other modes of transit, right? And what car sharing really plays a role in is really helping solve for those use cases where a car is the most appropriate. As an example, our members today, nearly half of them use transit 5 times a week, right? Which is certainly far more than the average sort of city resident, right? So we know transportation is an ecosystem, and if you don't own a car, right, you've effectively invested this sunk capital in that asset that is sitting there idle, on average 95 or 96% of the time, right? That's going to become your default mode of transportation because you've spent already $1,300 a month just on this asset that's sitting there waiting for you to use, right? So that induced demand of vehicle ownership is really what drives so many people to rely on vehicle ownership and consume an awful lot of resources, space in cities, and carbon emission and GHG. If we find alternatives to owning a vehicle like car share, like Uber and Lyft and Waymo and scooters and bike share and transit, which serves ultimately as the backbone for shared mobility services, people can develop a really car-free, car-light lifestyle that saves, by our estimate, like almost 80% of their budget, right? So we think, from our perspective, it's not one solution, like car sharing is the answer. It's all the solutions. It's an ecosystem of transit that really, I think, is catalyzed by smart city planners that help ensure a wide variety of options are available to their residents. So from our perspective, transit really does remain the backbone that solves the most frequent use cases in transit, like commuting, and other services become a supplement to that really create that more dynamic low-car lifestyle.
I think as humans, we are all driven by incentives. Simple as that, right? And to get back to the point of the late great Donald Shoup, right? If parking and using a car is easier than other forms, then people will park and drive, right? It's simple as that. If the cost of ownership of a car, parking the car, walking 10 minutes to get to your building because you have to park 10 minutes away, people will naturally do their own cost benefit analysis, right? So I think that's the part where it's less about prescription from cities and more about just letting the private industry, meaning each individual private entity, decide for themselves, but don't tilt it in the favor of driving, which is what the cities have done, specifically on the West Coast, right? As we have expanded westward, and as the modern car has come in westward, it's become the car-first world, right? And so again, we're all driven by incentives. So we don't need the government to intervene. We need the government actually to step back and let private industry, private entities decide for themselves, but don't tilt the scales.
I was going to ask if you
So,
have anything.
Yeah, I do think government has to be involved somewhat, but I agree with Gene that we don't have to put our fingers on the scale. To Justin's point, our role, even in my role as the commercial rideshare administrator, is to ensure that there are a suite of options for users and for people. So if we're going to say to you, you don't need a car, then the answer becomes, well, then how do I get around? And my role, I'm not on the bus side, but okay, we have buses for this. But if you're by yourself, maybe you can use this e-bike that's part of your bike share network that's 1 block from your place. Or if you need groceries or you're traveling with smaller children, you're not going to want to put them all on a bike. You want to do a car share. And you want to walk over and use that car share. You only need it for a couple hours. Get your groceries or take your kids somewhere, bring them back. But my role is to ensure you have a car share option. You have a mobility hub that has those options in place. You have a scooter that can get you around a little faster. You have an e-bike that can get you faster. You can choose to walk, you can choose to take a bus, or you can choose a car share, to get around. Or if none of those work for you, you can choose taxi, Uber, Lyft, Waymo. That's our role, to ensure that those things are available, and not just available on the west side. We want to have them available in South LA, in the Valley, and that's really, I think, where the city has to kind of step in, because often if we leave it to the private industry, they're going to go where it's most profitable, which is fair. We have no qualms with you going where it's most profitable, but we also want to ensure that there's some incentive for you to say, we know you can make some money here, but how about coming over here and doing work here, and we'll help. While I can't subsidize because we don't have any money, we're not bringing any federal dollars to the table on this. We can find ways to ensure that you can have some level of deployment and service in areas that maybe are a little less profitable, but that can help grow the use and the utilization of those areas. So I think that is part of what we have to do.
So my next question, I mentioned that I'm covering transportation and also rebuilding efforts focused on Altadena. So we've got 2 communities 30 miles apart that are currently figuring out how to rebuild or how to go forward. And I'm wondering, it's kind of a dreamer question, but for all of you, what do you think that they need to consider when they are thinking about how to rebuild, with mobility at the forefront, with sustainability at the forefront, with what we're talking about kind of in the back of their minds? I'll let you ponder it for a second.
I mean, I can jump in. I always think about how we currently fuel our transportation. And if you were to have like an exercise with an elementary school class and tell them to design an energy system, that would be ideal and clean and just almost make perfect sense. I feel like a vision of, solar that can power a building, that can then, with the spare capacity, power the transportation that's needed to get to those buildings, is a perfect cycle, right? And you compare that to the way that we've been doing things, where we're basically mining and burning and having all of this waste. It just seems like there's a very sharp divide. So as terrible as the fires have been, it's a utopian opportunity to create sort of this closed energy system of the future. And that could be really exciting to kind of really lean into, understand how electrification can span across both housing and transportation, and how energy can move as a unit between both of these. People talk a lot about distributed energy resources and DER, And you think about it, and like if energy, especially in California where there's just an abundance of it because of solar, if energy becomes in some ways, a currency that can move back and forth, in some ways batteries are wallets, right? And so you can store it in your car, you can move it back into the building. There's all of these interesting ways to start to put a framework together around energy as the foundation for how you build infrastructure.
I think this is actually the perfect time to begin reimagining how a city can look. I know that it seems really crazy right now and a lack of federal dollars and all those different things, but I do think now, it's not so much risk anymore. Like, necessity is the mother of invention, and so now we're in a space where now we get to rethink how it should look, and we don't have to be hemmed in by the way it used to look. And I always think about, I lived in San Francisco for a long time, and I remember, along the waterfront, there was the Embarcadero Freeway. Everyone was very used to that freeway. It was the fastest way if you got out of Oakland to get into Chinatown in San Francisco. You go through, and then an earthquake happens. It has to be torn down. People were still feeling like, but I need a quick way to get to Chinatown. I need a quick way to get into North Beach. But the city took its time to reimagine what its waterfront could look like, because that freeway blocked the entire waterfront. If you look at the buildings that were built while the freeway was up, it didn't have windows facing the water because you're facing a freeway. And now it has this beautiful promenade from Pier 1 all the way down to 39, where you walk along the waterfront, everyone's running along it. People can't even imagine that there used to be a double-decker freeway that covered that entire thing running through. But it took a disaster for the city to reimagine how it was going to look. And I think that's where we are now. Regardless of whether it's the fires or how we feel about the unpredictability of administrations, this is now the time to reimagine. How can this look? How can we now make this look without being hemmed in by the way we used to do it or how it used to be? So that's how I view the future of us.
Did any of you want to weigh in to put you on the spot?
I think doing radical change is really hard. And I think trying to take micro steps, especially in these communities that are just rebuilding from like a fire. So I don't know, there's little things about the way you get deliveries to your house. That was one thing, most of these houses were built, you weren't having deliveries brought to your doorstep. And then in a lot of these areas, there's really high targets. So I think when you're just little things you can do when you're building a new community is how do you make it more efficient for deliveries to go into those communities. They go into each doorstep. Can you make delivery hubs that can be done, like collection boxes that you see in more planned, newer developments? So I think just little things you can come into when you're doing rebuilds is just thinking the way you can manage access, just your deliveries that are now common. When these areas were built, they weren't having every single, 20 deliveries per day on roads or 50 deliveries per day. I think that's the one way to look at it, is just managing the things that you're kind of already having problems on, and how can you solve them when you're rebuilding on your own independent level. I think you can take control of that yourself when you're actually building it, and that the city can help guide it, but even just when you're just give guidance and instructions and tips could be a good way for it.
So we have about 5 minutes left. I'm going to ask a question that I always end my interviews with is, what didn't I ask you about that you wanted to bring up today? So I don't know if any of you have a thought that you didn't get to mention that you think is something should be at the forefront right now as we're talking about all of these sort of issues.
I can start. So I was at a roundtable a few weeks ago in DC during Liberation Week. Everyone? And sitting at the roundtable was a Republican mayor from a red state. And every time someone at the roundtable said the words CFI or NEVI, he just screamed, "That's gone!" And so I think that when we are having this conversation of if federal funding, I think we have to remove the if clearly and not put any bets on that anymore, and really think about reorganizing our minds to infrastructure without federal support for the next 4 years, and just liberate ourselves of that expectation.
I'd like to get us back to this idea of supply and demand of curb space, right? To the point that it really is not a supply issue. It's a matter of prioritization of the supply. If we look at how supply can be increased you can increase supply virtually by increasing the use case of that same supply, right? So that on-street parking can now become 4 or 5 different use cases. Now you've quadrupled that same use case, right? So it's about, I think, smart private partnerships like we talked about. It's about smart digital integrations like we talked about. But ultimately, it's about the city realizing that they have a literal gold mine, not only in terms of revenues, but in terms of really dictating policy for the benefit of the public. What we have truly is an opportunity for the cities to take advantage of the supply-demand mismatch, to realize they have leverage now. They are on the part that's rare supply, and by networking the supply together and thinking about an opportunity to really work with private industry, but really just invite them in. And if the carrot is not going to work, then the stick comes next. But this is the opportunity for cities really to take ownership and to realize that it's their opportunity to really make this work for the people.
And I'll add, Zipcar, our business is really about providing access to a shared vehicle over the high cost and hassle of owning one. That's what we've been doing for 25 years, right? And we're here at Curbivore for 2 reasons. One, to highlight the success that we've seen in partnering with cities to use the curb to accelerate that growth, the growth for our business and the impact that cities want to see, to provide more equitable transportation, more sustainable transportation with small investments, because again, federal investment is drying up. Small investments of the curb can have a really powerful impact in accelerating that future. The second reason we're here is that over the course of 25 years, we've learned that our primary business has been direct to consumer, really helping individuals who want to live that low-car lifestyle provide access to transportation. But increasingly, as many of the services in this room increase, we're finding incredible value for people who need access to a car to earn, or who need access to a car to work, or organizations that also don't want the high cost and hassle of fleet ownership. And from our perspective, that's really the next big vector of growth for shared access to mobility, shared access to transportation, shared access to vehicles, for people who need a car to earn, people who need a car to work, organizations that don't want to own fleets, and we think that's really the next frontier. So we're excited to talk to and partner with organizations that have an interest in growing with us.
Yeah, I think for us, you see the curb's always evolving. The curb is a constant change. A big takeaway I would say from this is you see newspaper stands all around the city on the sidewalks, on the curb. They're not used anymore. And that's what this constant evolutions that you mentioned before, the taxi and the curb. How do we bring new technology solutions and the new amenities that helps local communities, and how can cities kind of move quicker in getting private sectors to come into it and kind of take over those spaces that were used for things that are 10 years ago or 15 years ago haven't been used, and it's still fixtures that are being used today, and have a new generation of use on those mobility spots.
Yeah, and I'll say, as a person who works in the city, and this is really for the private sector, to not be afraid to talk to us and to bring your innovative ideas. I mean, the group we have up here is very well versed in working with the private sector or with the public sector, and I think private entities are getting better about that. But oftentimes there's still a lot of trepidation when they're working with cities, particularly if they want to begin bringing a product that's a service on the right of way. And so I would say that the thing, and this is for those of you out there in the private sector, approach the city, bring your ideas, and share your data. We don't want every single piece of data that you've ever received for your business. And I don't necessarily need to know the secret sauce of how it all works. But if you want to work within our communities, help us understand your business, help us understand how you're helping the community, and then we can help you grow. With private sector, there's a fear that regulation means I have the right to say no. And don't get me wrong, cities and government agencies have used regulation to give me the hammer to say no. But I can tell you that a lot of cities, including Los Angeles, we look at regulation as a way to help stem growth and ensure service throughout all of our communities. And that's how we do it. So don't be afraid to talk to us, and do not be afraid to share data with cities.
Great. Well, thank you all for the conversation. I learned a lot. Please give a round to our panelists for doing a great job.